The sun sat high above the wide-open land, shining down on the dusty ground like a spotlight. The air was warm, and the smell of hay, leather, and horses filled the arena. People from small towns nearby had gathered to watch the big demonstration. Families, ranch owners, and young cowboys leaned against the wooden fence, their hats shading their faces. Everyone was talking, laughing, and waiting for the show to begin. In the middle of that fenced area stood a young woman named Clara. Her long brown hair was tied back in a braid, and her boots were dusty from the morning's work. She loved horses more than anything in the world. For years she had worked as a trainer, helping scared and hurt horses learn to trust people again. Today, however, was different. This time she was not just working with a horse. She was part of the demonstration. The announcer's voice echoed across the loudspeakers. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, drawing everyone's attention. "Today you'll see a real lesson in control and courage. You'll see how fear can be broken and trust can be built." Clara's heart beat a little faster. She had agreed to do this because she wanted to prove that kindness worked better than force. She wanted to show that no matter how scared an animal or a person was, they could find safety again. But standing in the center with so many eyes watching made her feel small. She could feel the dust under her boots and the dryness in her throat. Two helpers stepped forward, bringing a set of long, cold demonstration chains. These were normally used to control wild horses during training, to keep them from hurting themselves or others. Today, the handlers were going to show how it felt from the animal's point of view. Clara had agreed to stand in for the horse. She believed it would help people understand how fear could grow inside a living being. The metal felt cold as it touched her wrists. It wasn't painful, but it was firm. The sound of the chains clicking shut echoed like a clock ticking loudly in a quiet room. People around the fence grew quiet. The warm wind lifted her hair slightly as she stood tall in the center. Clara reminded herself to breathe. "You're safe. You chose this. You can show them what fear looks like," she thought. But even with that thought, something inside her felt uneasy. It wasn't just the chains. It was the way the crowd watched, curious, excited, waiting for something they didn't fully understand. On the far side of the arena, a man stood apart from the others. He wore an old hat, dusty jeans, and boots that looked like they had walked many miles. His name was Daniel. He was a cowboy, not the kind who liked to show off, but the kind who worked quietly and spoke softly to his horses. His calmness was something people respected. He had come that day not for entertainment, but to see how the demonstration would be handled. He didn't like when people used fear to control animals, even if they said it was just a lesson. Daniel's sharp blue eyes followed every movement in the arena. He saw the way Clara's shoulders stiffened when the chain clicked. He noticed the way her hands trembled just slightly, even though she tried to look calm. He saw her lips pressed together like she was holding back something, a feeling, a thought, maybe even a memory. The announcer spoke again, louder now. "What you see here is how a creature reacts when they are not free. Fear can make them wild, or it can make them silent." The handlers walked around Clara, pulling the chains gently to show the crowd how control worked. The chains didn't hurt her, but they made her movements stiff. Every sound felt louder, the clinking of metal, the shuffling boots, the soft coughs in the crowd. She could feel people's eyes on her like a weight pressing down. Clara wasn't just acting. She was feeling. She thought about the horses she had rescued, wild ones that trembled when humans came near. She remembered their wide eyes, their shaky breathing, and their quiet pleas for kindness without using words. Now, standing here, she understood even more deeply what they must have felt. She turned her head slowly and scanned the crowd. Most faces were blank or curious, but then she saw him, the cowboy. Daniel's eyes weren't like the others. They weren't hungry for a show. They were soft, steady, almost like he could hear her thoughts. She felt a strange calmness flow through her chest. For a second, it was just the two of them, even though the arena was full. Daniel tilted his head slightly, almost like he was silently asking, "Are you okay?" Clara didn't speak, but something in her heart answered, "Not really." The announcer continued to talk, explaining how control worked, how fear made creatures submit. But Daniel's attention stayed on Clara. He could see how she lifted her chin higher to keep herself strong. She wasn't weak, she was brave. She was standing there so people could learn. That kind of courage wasn't loud. It was quiet and powerful. The helpers pulled the chain again, gently but enough to make her stumble a little. A small gasp ran through the crowd. Clara steadied herself, breathing slowly, reminding herself it was only a demonstration. She thought of every frightened horse she had ever stood beside, whispering soft words to calm them down. Now, she whispered to herself, "It's just a show. You're safe. Breathe." But deep inside, something shifted. She realized how easily fear could grow even without pain. Just being bound, just being watched, just being controlled without having a voice, that was enough to make someone feel small. She looked down at her boots, covered with thin dust, and remembered the first time she'd seen a horse chained. It had been years ago, a young stallion shaking in the corner of a pen. Everyone told her the horse was too wild, too dangerous, too broken. But Clara had sat next to that fence for hours, whispering gently. Slowly, the horse had trusted her, step by careful step. She had promised herself that day that she'd always be kind to creatures who couldn't speak. And here she was now, standing in their place. The crowd began to whisper among themselves. Some people laughed nervously. Others grew quiet, maybe understanding a little more of what the demonstration meant. A small boy tugged at his father's arm and whispered, "She looks scared." The father didn't answer, but Daniel heard it, and the words made something inside him tighten. Daniel stepped closer to the fence, resting one hand on the wooden rail. His boots pressed into the dirt. He wanted to step in, but it wasn't his show. Still, he couldn't ignore what he saw. It wasn't wrong to teach people about fear, but it was wrong to let it grow without kindness. The announcer asked the handlers to pull the chain again, this time a little firmer. Clara's arms stiffened. Her chest rose and fell as she tried to stay steady. The noise in the arena faded for her. She could hear only the sound of the metal and her own heartbeat. She lifted her eyes again and found Daniel. This time she didn't look away. His calm stare was like a rope she could hold onto in the storm. She didn't speak, but her eyes said what words couldn't. "Please understand. Please see me. Please see that I'm not just part of a show." Daniel's hand curled tighter on the fence. He took a slow step closer. He didn't shout or move fast. He just let her know he was there. And somehow that small act gave her strength. Her shoulders relaxed a little. Her breathing slowed. She stood straighter, not because the chains were gone, but because she felt less alone. Around them, the show went on. The announcer talked about control. The crowd reacted. But between Clara and Daniel, a quiet, wordless understanding grew. It wasn't dramatic or loud, but it was powerful. It was the kind of moment people rarely noticed. But for the two souls inside it, everything changed. Clara remembered the promise she had made long ago, to never let fear win. And though her wrists were bound, she felt stronger now than when she first stepped into the arena. She closed her eyes for a second, breathing in the warm air, and whispered softly to herself, "This is for them." She meant every frightened horse, every gentle creature, every living soul that deserved kindness. Daniel didn't hear the words, but he saw them on her lips. His heart tightened in a way he hadn't expected. He knew then that this wasn't just a demonstration. It was something deeper, a story about trust, courage, and the quiet strength that lives inside someone who stands alone but refuses to break. As the announcer prepared to move to the next part of the demonstration, the crowd shifted, but Daniel didn't move away. Clara opened her eyes and met his gaze once more. This time, she wasn't asking for help. She was sharing a silent promise: "I'm strong, but thank you for seeing me." The moment passed in silence, but it would be remembered by both of them long after the dust of the arena settled. The crowd had fallen into a strange silence. The announcer's voice still floated through the air, but it felt like the wind had carried away most of its strength. People were watching, but their laughter and chatter had faded. Something quiet but powerful had settled over the arena. Clara stood in the center, her hands still caught in the demonstration chains. The metal no longer felt just cold. It felt heavier now, as if it carried every unspoken fear she had ever seen in an animal's eyes. Her heartbeat was steady, not fast, but strong. Her breath came slow and deep, like the rhythm of a horse learning to trust again. Daniel stood at the fence, watching her with the same calmness he had shown before. He had seen a lot of things in his life: storms, wild horses, even broken fences. But he had never seen someone stand so tall while carrying so much quiet pain. He could feel something in his chest stirring, something that pushed him forward. The announcer told the handlers to tighten the chains a little more, just for the last part of the demonstration. They followed the instructions not out of cruelty, but because that was the way it had always been done. Clara didn't fight it. She simply closed her eyes for a moment as if she was somewhere else. Somewhere quiet, safe, far away from all those eyes. But when she opened her eyes again, she looked straight at Daniel. She didn't speak loudly. She didn't make a big scene. She simply whispered in a soft, almost trembling voice, "Please, claim me." The words were not meant to be dramatic. They were not part of a show. It was a simple plea, a way to ask him to step in to help bring the act to an end. She trusted him without even knowing why. Maybe it was because he had the kind of eyes that didn't just look. They saw Daniel didn't hesitate. He stepped forward slowly, his boots pressing into the dirt with a soft sound. The announcer looked confused for a moment, unsure why someone from the crowd was moving into the arena. The handlers also paused, not expecting anyone to interrupt. But Daniel didn't care about the surprise around him. He wasn't thinking about rules or the script of the demonstration. He was only thinking about the young woman standing there with quiet courage in her eyes. When Daniel reached her, he didn't grab the chains roughly. Instead, he touched the metal gently like he would with a frightened horse. Clara felt the change in energy right away. His touch was steady, not rushed, not forceful. For the first time since the demonstration started, the chains didn't feel like something meant to control her. They felt like something that was about to be lifted away. Daniel looked at the handlers. His voice was calm but clear. "I'll take it from here," he said. It wasn't a demand. It was more like a promise, simple and firm. Something about the way he spoke made the handlers step back. Even the announcer didn't argue. Maybe they felt what the crowd felt. This moment was no longer about putting on a show. Something real was happening. Clara stood perfectly still as Daniel slowly loosened the chains. The sound of each small click seemed louder than anything else in the world. When the final link opened, she let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She didn't stumble or fall. She simply lifted her wrists slowly, feeling the air touch her skin again, and lowered them softly at her sides. The crowd didn't clap. They didn't cheer. But they also didn't talk. For a moment, everyone just stood still, watching. It was the kind of silence that wasn't empty. It was full of something quiet and strong. People felt it in their hearts, even if they couldn't explain it in words. Daniel didn't step away after freeing her. He stayed close, not to protect her, but to let her know she wasn't alone. Clara lifted her eyes to his, and for a few seconds the world outside the arena disappeared. It wasn't about fear anymore. It was about being seen and understood. The announcer tried to continue with the demonstration, but even his voice had softened. He spoke a few words about trust and courage, but everyone's mind was already on what they had just witnessed. It wasn't the planned ending, but it was the one people would remember. Clara turned slowly and faced the crowd. She didn't need to give a speech. Her presence was enough. Her eyes held a story, one about pain, strength, and quiet bravery. She wasn't a performer. She was a living example of what fear and kindness looked like standing side by side. Daniel walked beside her toward the edge of the arena. The handlers didn't stop him. In fact, some of them looked down at the ground, thoughtful, like they were seeing things differently now. A few people in the crowd gave small nods. Some whispered softly, and some simply stood in silence, taking in what had happened. Outside the fence, Clara finally let out a long, slow breath. She rubbed her wrists gently where the metal had been. They weren't hurt, but they carried the memory of the feeling. Daniel stood next to her, still quiet. He didn't ask if she was okay. He didn't need to. She looked at him and gave a small, grateful smile. "Thank you," she whispered. Daniel tipped his hat slightly, a quiet gesture that said more than words ever could. "You didn't need me," he said softly. "You were strong all along." Clara shook her head. "Sometimes being strong doesn't mean doing it alone," she said. Her voice was soft but firm, like a calm river moving through a quiet valley. Daniel looked out over the arena. "They'll remember this," he said. Clara followed his gaze. People were still standing around the fence, not rushing to leave. It was as if something invisible had passed through them, something gentle that made them look at the world a little differently. Maybe they would think twice the next time they saw fear in someone's eyes, animal or human. As the sun began to lower a little, the light grew softer, turning the dust in the air into a golden mist. The day was still warm, but the air felt calmer now. Clara wrapped her arms around herself, not out of fear, but as if she was holding a new kind of strength inside her. Daniel glanced at her again. "Why did you agree to do this?" he asked quietly. Clara thought for a moment before answering. "Because people need to understand," she said. "They need to feel, not just watch. If they can feel even a little of what fear is like, maybe they'll be kinder." Daniel nodded slowly. "You're braver than you think," he said. Clara smiled faintly. "I'm just trying to keep a promise." "To who?" Daniel asked. "To every creature that couldn't speak," she replied softly. "To every pair of eyes that ever looked at me and said, 'Help me,' without words." Daniel didn't say anything more. He didn't need to. The truth in her words was strong enough to stand on its own. The sound of horses in the distance filled the quiet between them. It wasn't awkward. It was peaceful. Some of the handlers came over to them. They didn't look proud like before. They looked thoughtful, maybe even changed. One of them, an older man with gray hair and kind eyes, spoke softly. "You made us see something today," he said to Clara. "It wasn't the lesson we planned, but it was the one we needed." Clara nodded gently. "Thank you for letting me finish it my way," she replied. The man shook his head slowly. "No," he said. "Thank you for showing us a better way." A few people from the crowd came closer too, not to ask for pictures or praise, but simply to look at her with quiet respect. One woman held her young daughter's hand and whispered, "She was so brave." The little girl nodded, eyes wide, as if she had seen something she would never forget. As the arena slowly emptied, Daniel and Clara stood side by side near the gate. The wind picked up slightly, brushing against their faces. Daniel looked at her with a soft smile. "You changed something today," he said. Clara shook her head lightly. "I didn't change anything," she said. "I just reminded them what's already inside." Daniel chuckled softly. "Not everyone can do that." For the first time since the morning, Clara felt completely free. It wasn't just about the chains being gone. It was about being truly seen and understood. She felt lighter, as if a quiet strength had grown inside her chest. They walked together toward the stables, the golden light stretching their shadows across the ground. Clara reached out to stroke the nose of a nearby horse, and it leaned into her touch with quiet trust. The simple warmth of that moment washed away the weight of the demonstration. Daniel leaned against the fence, watching her. "I've seen a lot of things," he said softly, "but I've never seen something like today." Clara laughed quietly. "Neither have I," she said. "But maybe that's the point. Sometimes the best moments aren't planned. They just happen." He nodded slowly, a faint smile on his lips. "And sometimes they change everything." The horse nudged her hand gently as if agreeing. Clara smiled, feeling the warmth of that simple gesture. She wasn't alone anymore. Not in the arena, not in the quiet places inside her heart. As the last of the crowd disappeared down the dusty path, the world seemed softer, kinder. The chains were gone, but the lesson remained, not just for her, not just for Daniel, but for everyone who had witnessed that silent moment when fear met kindness and kindness won. Clara turned to Daniel one last time before walking into the warm light of the setting sun. "Thank you for listening without me having to speak," she said softly. Daniel tipped his hat again and smiled. "You didn't need to speak," he replied. "Some things are heard without words." And with that, the day ended not with a loud cheer, but with a quiet truth. Sometimes the most powerful moments are the softest ones.